You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your comments below. And be sure to smash that like button. LSU will welcome a SWAC opponent in Tiger Stadium for the second time in history. Of course, Southern a year ago, and on Saturday, it'll be the Grambling Tigers and head coach Hue Jackson coming into Tiger Stadium. Matt Belinson covers Grambling for the Ruston Leader. Good enough to join us for a couple of minutes here. Matt, we appreciate it, man. How are you?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure. What's it like covering Hue Jackson, man? Former NFL head coach there at Grambling.
Yeah, it's interesting. You can definitely tell that it took some time for him to adjust to the college level. Obviously, like you mentioned, a lot of people know him from his NFL coaching days. And he even admitted himself that, coming to a SWAC HBCU school, it took some time for him to kind of recognize that it takes time to build a culture here to kind of get the roster that you want. And certainly even dealing with the media too, obviously different types of media obligations, obviously less coverage just in terms of the amount of beat reporters compared to an NFL team or some of the, other college teams that he was an assistant for in years past. So, he's been good to work with. I can definitely tell that he's still trying to get his feet under him. And, obviously his group's going to have a tough time with it on Saturday here against LSU.
We'll delve into the game a little bit, but I'm curious, Matt, is from a 3-8 season a year ago to a roster that has a whole lot of transfers, as you might expect, does it look like Hue Jackson has it trending in the right direction? Because sometimes that transition from NFL to college can be difficult for coaches because it's so dramatically different.
Yeah, like you mentioned, obviously they lost the opener to Hampton to start this season 0-1, and in all likelihood they're going to start 0-2 with a loss to LSU. So, in terms of the wins and losses, I would certainly say as an objective observer, I think you still have to see if it's trending in the right direction. Certainly he and his players are talking like it's trending in the right direction. But again, at some point, a historic program like this that, once had a lot of historic success in this conference, I think it's getting to a point where I think people are, tired of talking about seeing things, move in a positive direction. I think they want to start seeing it. Obviously with Dion out of the SWAC now, and, Jackson State obviously, took a tough loss to Florida A&M to start their season. So there's a lot of teams in this conference that certainly feel like they're moving in a positive direction. I think for Grambling State and its fans, obviously a lot of historic success. They want to see it. And so I think going forward, you're optimistic that they've maybe found a quarterback. But again, it's kind of tough to say after one game. But I would say in general, I think this season will really tell us a lot, as to whether or not Hue has everything under control.
When I look at the roster, Matt, I could see transfers from Tennessee, from Ole Miss, from Kennesaw State, from Southern Utah, all over. Is it safe to say that Hue Jackson has attacked the transfer portal and they're trying to build this roster through Power 5 and FBS transfers?
Yeah, I would say that is the approach. Again, obviously playing in the SWAC, it's just a different caliber of athlete. And, obviously, again, when you're coaching in North Louisiana, maybe the talent pool on paper isn't as deep and as rich at a place like, LSU and some places in the southern part of the state. But I think for him, like you mentioned before, got a guy out of South Alabama, wide receiver from the transfer portal, brought in a kid from Tennessee. He was a preferred walk-on at Tennessee, so he didn't really get a whole lot of action. So I think for him, the transfer portal pickups, like you mentioned, they're not only FBS projects. I think it's really just kind of a last chance you in a way for a lot of guys. Obviously coming to Grambling State, people, they're going to have opportunities, whereas, you go to an LSU, you might be buried on the depth chart for a number of years. And so I think for Hue Jackson, I think he's recognized that the recruiting approach has to go a little bit differently. I think they can't, maybe put their targets as high as they maybe would like to. I think they have to kind of search the bottom of these depth charts. I think they have to find guys that maybe never had an opportunity, but were certainly good enough to be recruited to these schools. And so I think that's the way they're trying to do it. Again, I think the results still have to speak for themselves.
A couple more minutes here. Matt Belinson is our guest from the Ruston Leader, covers Grambling, who'll be in Tiger Stadium this weekend. So you mentioned they think they found a quarterback there. Miles Crawley threw for 300 yards against Hampton in a high-scoring loss, 35-31. What can you tell us about Crawley?
Yeah, he's a transfer from Alabama State that came in, during the offseason, and kind of similar to last fall camp for Grambling. It was a quarterback battle, pretty much up until, this past Saturday with Hampton. Miles was battling with, returning starter, Julian Calvez. He was a freshman last year, Calvez was. Didn't exactly light the world on fire. Not a high completion percentage. Grambling was one of 2 SWAC teams without a 1,000-yard passer. So it was pretty clear that even though Calvez, was going to come back as, a returning starter, on paper, I think it was pretty clear that this team needed to upgrade at the position. And yeah, Crawley came in, game 1, 300 yards, 2 touchdowns. It's crazy to think, just given this program's success, he's the first Grambling quarterback since 2018 to throw for 300 yards. So I definitely think it's game 1 encouragement for Hue, to pull a guy out of the portal and maybe comes in and produces like that. But I think again, we have to see that for a full season until I think it's truly kind of understood that this team is kind of back on its feet.
We all know LSU's pass defense struggled mightily against Florida State. Little bit of a different animal with Jordan Travis, a 6-year senior, and Keon Coleman, who's probably a first-round draft pick. But should we anticipate Grambling's going to come in to Tiger Stadium on Saturday and sling it around and try to throw for a bunch of yards?
Yeah, I would definitely say if you had to pick, either run heavy or pass heavy, I would say this team is going to lean on Miles. They're going to let him kind of figure it out. They're going to throw him into the fire. And like you mentioned, they've brought in guys from the transfer portal to kind of beef up that wide receiver room. They feel like there's a lot of skill in that room. Obviously, you return Lennon Rash after 500 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns last year as an all SWAC guy. So they feel pretty high about their skill positions. They do return some, running backs. Floyd Chalk was the Bayou Classic MVP, had a pretty decent showing against Hampton last week. But I would say just in terms of the attack pattern, I would imagine that they're not going to, try and run into this LSU defensive line, too much, especially with Mason Smith coming back. I can't imagine they're going to say, Floyd Chalk, why don't we just, run you at him for, 15 carries tonight. I have a feeling it's going to be a lot of Miles Crawley. And again, I think those LSU DBs certainly were, going to be looking for some redemption after Florida State on Sunday.
Is there a perceived or even unquestioned strength of this Grambling team, either side of the ball?
I would say going into the season, it was definitely the defensive front. That started, Brian Kelly mentioned it in kind of his opening presser on Tuesday. Lewis Matthews, a 5th-year linebacker for this team, a preseason all-SWAC player, and then also Sundiata Anderson, an edge rusher for this team. He's on some NFL draft boards as a SWAC guy, kind of a day 3 pick. He's bulked up in the offseason. He had 8 sacks last year, 15.5 tackles for loss. He didn't finish with a sack against Hampton. Clearly, the Pirates had to, I'm sure, game plan for him, and I'm sure LSU will as well. So it'll be interesting to see if both of those guys can make an impact. Lewis is certainly a tackling machine, had over 100 tackles last year, definitely on pace to do that again this year if he can stay healthy. So I would say it's the defensive front for this unit. Again, I have a feeling LSU is probably going to get the ball out quick. They're going to, let their playmakers kind of, cook in space. And I can't imagine they're just going to ask, this offensive line to just go straight drop back. And maybe they will, because, obviously, LSU's got some, pretty capable offensive linemen that I think can maybe handle Sundiata. But I would say on paper, that's probably the strength of this team if you had to pick one.
If Hue Jackson had a best case for Saturday night, realistically, LSU's going to win this game, and it's probably one of those name your score type things. But if you're Hue Jackson, what is a best case scenario for his team on Saturday night?
Yeah, like you mentioned, I think the score, it's kind of a pick your score type of game. I think really if you're Hue Jackson, I think you really want to see 2 things. I think you want to see some semblance of the passing game that you saw against Hampton. I'm not going to predict that Miles Crawley is going to throw for 300 yards, certainly not. But if you can see them put together maybe 1 or 2 drives, that maybe gets close to a score where you feel like Miles is in control, the lights aren't too big for him, I feel like that's a win because, obviously, game 1 against Hampton, that's a different level of competition. If you can come out of this game and saying, definitively, Miles is our quarterback, he can command an offense, the bright lights of Tiger Stadium and that pass rush did not get the better of him. I think that's a huge win. I think a second win is kind of on an individual level. I think, again, if Sundiata Anderson and some of these kind of fringe NFL prospect guys, if they can make like a couple tackles for loss, or if they could, kind of get their way into a sack, if maybe some coverage, doesn't line up, I think that's a massive win just in terms of recruiting, to say, hey, you know what? You come to Grambling State, maybe don't talk about the score, but, if you come to Grambling State, you have an opportunity to play against the LSUs of the world. We go on the road and play in these big classics. NFL scouts are going to be at these games they want to watch. And so, you're going to have your opportunities for these big stages to perform. And so I think those are probably the only 2, wins, I guess, if you wanted to say it. Certainly I think Hue and this coaching staff recognize that, they are going to come into this game, at a pretty large deficit.
Matt Belinson covering Grambling there for the Ruston Leader. Good stuff, Matt. We appreciate a couple of minutes, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.